This story is titled AITAH for refusing to let my kids back into my life after they chose money. Over me, ignored me for years, and only returned when they needed something. There's a certain kind of pain that doesn't just live in your heart. It settles deep into your bones, weaving itself into every breath you take, every thought you have, every moment you wish you could forget. It's the kind of pain that lingers, that refuses to dull over time, that no amount of distraction or self-reassurance can erase. That's the pain I've been carrying for the past 8 years. And no matter how much I tell myself I've moved on, it still finds ways to remind me that it never truly left. I never thought my life would turn out this way. If you had told me a decade ago that I'd be sitting here, looking back at the wreckage of what was once my family, I would have laughed, shaken my head, said something about how, sure, marriage has its ups and downs, but at the end of the day, love is supposed to mean something. Commitment is supposed to mean something. But as it turns out, not everyone sees it that way. My name is John, and for most of my adult life, I believed I had built something solid, a life worth holding on to, a marriage that, despite its struggles, would stand the test of time. My wife, Marie, and I had been together for over 20 years. We had 2 kids, Gavin and Hannah, who, for all their flaws, I had always been proud of. I thought we had a good thing. Maybe not perfect, maybe not without its fair share of storms, but good. I should have known better. Looking back, I can see the cracks that were forming long before everything fell apart. Marie had never been fully content. She wanted more money, more comfort, more of the kind of life that made other women jealous. And me? I was a high school baseball coach. I wasn't pulling in 6 figures, wasn't climbing any corporate ladders, wasn't handing her luxury vacations or diamond bracelets. But I loved what I did. Coaching wasn't just a job to me, it was a purpose, a way to shape young men into something better, to teach them discipline, resilience, the kind of values that last a lifetime. I thought she understood that. Turns out she never did. I came home early that day. I remember feeling exhausted, the weight of practice and paperwork hanging on my shoulders. But there was this small part of me that was looking forward to a quiet evening. Maybe we'd order takeout, sit on the couch, talk about nothing and everything. I didn't need much to be happy, just the feeling that, at the end of the day, I had a place to belong. I walked through the door and knew instantly that something was wrong. There was a jacket draped over the back of the couch that didn't belong to me, a pair of shoes in the hallway, bigger than mine. And then I heard voices, low, murmuring, too intimate for strangers, too familiar for friends. I don't remember pushing the door open, but I do remember the way time seemed to stretch and slow the moment I saw them. Marie, tangled up with another man, her hands on him the way they used to be on me, the way she looked at him, like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. I didn't yell. I didn't scream or throw things. I just stood there, feeling like the air had been sucked out of my lungs, like my entire world had just shifted beneath my feet and I had nothing left to hold on to. She looked at me, and I saw it, the flash of guilt, but only for a second. Then it was gone, replaced by something colder, something like resignation, like she had already made her choice long before I walked in. She didn't apologize. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She simply told me that things hadn't been working for a long time, that she had been feeling suffocated, that she needed something else, something more. And just like that, the life I had spent decades building came crashing down around me. I walked out that night. I didn't argue, didn't ask her why, because in the end, what did it matter? She had already decided I wasn't enough. The divorce was swift, brutal in its efficiency. She got the house, she got most of our savings, and worst of all, she got the kids. Not because of some court ruling, not because I was an unfit father, but because they chose her. I still don't understand it, even after all these years. Maybe she told them a version of the story that made me the villain. Maybe they had always seen me as the man who couldn't give their mother the life she wanted, and that, to them, was worse than what she had done. Maybe they just wanted to keep the peace, to avoid choosing sides, and in doing so, they abandoned me completely. At first I tried. I called, I texted, I reached out in every way I could, hoping they would see that I was still here, still their father, still the man who had raised them, loved them. But the responses became shorter, the conversations more distant. Until eventually, there was nothing. They stopped inviting me to family gatherings. Then they stopped answering my calls. And then, one day, I opened Facebook and saw that Gavin had gotten married. A big, beautiful wedding. Smiling faces, happy guests. Marie and her new husband standing proudly beside him. I wasn't even invited. The same thing happened with Hannah. I found out through a mutual friend that she had gotten married, that she had a whole new life, and I wasn't a part of it. Marie had moved on, seamlessly transitioning from our life together into one that suited her better. And my kids had followed. They took jobs from her new husband, called him Dad, let him step into the place I had once stood without so much as a second thought. I won't lie and say it didn't break me, because it did. For years, I lived in that hollow space between anger and grief, between the urge to fight for what I had lost and the quiet acceptance that maybe, just maybe, it was already too late. I kept asking myself what I had done wrong, what I could have changed, what part of me had been so easy to erase. But in the end, there was no answer. Sometimes people make choices you'll never understand. And sometimes, no matter how much love you give, it's just not enough. In the months that followed the divorce, I learned that grief is not just about loss. It's about absence, about the way silence can stretch and fill a space where something meaningful used to be. It's about walking through rooms that were once shared and realizing that they are just walls now, just furniture, just things without context. I'd spent so many years measuring my life by the people in it, by the rituals of a family I had believed was mine, by the quiet moments that at the time had seemed so ordinary, Sunday breakfasts, late night conversations, the sound of my kids laughing in the other room. But when all of that is stripped away, what remains is something unrecognizable, something hollow and unfamiliar, like a house that no longer feels like home. At first, I thought I could fix it. I convinced myself that this kind of estrangement, this distance between me and my children, was temporary, just a byproduct of the chaos, a moment of confusion that would pass once they saw things clearly. I told myself that time had a way of straightening things out, of making people realize what truly mattered. And so I reached out. I sent messages that went unanswered, left voicemails that were never returned. I tried to hold on, even when the silence on the other end became heavier with each passing day. I remember the first time I realized, really realized, that I had become an outsider in their lives. It wasn't a single moment, not one sharp break, but a slow, steady accumulation of small things. Birthdays I wasn't invited to, milestones I heard about secondhand, the realization that they had built new traditions without me. I would hear from mutual friends that Gavin had landed a new job, that Hannah had moved into a new house, that they were thriving in a world where I no longer existed. It was disorienting, this feeling of watching from the outside, of knowing that the people I had raised, the children I had loved more than anything, had chosen to move forward without looking back. For a while, I told myself that maybe this was just their way of coping, that maybe they needed space to process everything. But deep down, I knew the truth. They had made their choice, and it wasn't me. I had always thought that love was enough, that the years spent coaching Gavin's little league games, helping Hannah with her homework, tucking them in at night with stories and whispered reassurances, had built something unbreakable. But love, as it turns out, is not a shield against betrayal. It does not guarantee loyalty. It does not ensure that the people you give your heart to will keep it safe. Marie had moved on effortlessly, stepping into her new life with the kind of ease that made it seem as though the years we had spent together had been nothing more than a prelude to something better. And somehow my children had followed her lead. They had embraced her new husband, a man they had once barely known, with an openness that they had never extended to me after the divorce. It was as if I had been rewritten in their story, my role diminished to that of a distant memory, a footnote in a life they no longer felt connected to. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. It wasn't even the way they had so seamlessly replaced me. It was the realization that, despite everything, I still missed them. I still wanted to be their father. I still wanted to be part of their lives, but I couldn't force them to want the same. I spent those first few years drifting, untethered from the life I had once known. I went to work, came home, sat in an empty house that no longer felt like it belonged to me. The walls seemed quieter, the air heavier, the nights longer. I told myself that I had to keep moving forward, that I had to find something new to hold on to, but the truth was, I didn't know how. It wasn't until I hit rock bottom that I realized I had to make a choice. I could keep chasing something that had already left me behind, keep waiting for people who had no intention of turning back, or I could start building something for myself, something that didn't depend on the approval or acceptance of others. And so I chose to start over. I had spent years defining myself by what I had lost, by the roles that had been taken from me: husband, father, provider. But those titles no longer fit. They were relics of a past that no longer existed. I needed something new, something that belonged solely to me. I started small. I focused on my work, poured myself into coaching with a new kind of intensity. The kind that came not from obligation, but from the need to find purpose again. I stopped checking my phone for messages that would never come. I stopped looking at old photos, stopped replaying conversations in my head, stopped waiting for an apology that I knew would never arrive. And little by little, the weight began to lift. I found comfort in the small victories, in the steady rhythm of a life rebuilt. I reconnected with old friends, took up hobbies I had long abandoned, allowed myself to enjoy the simple pleasures of solitude rather than fear them. And for the first time in years, I began to feel like I was no longer just existing, I was living. But just when I thought I had finally left the past behind, when I had convinced myself that I no longer needed the people who had walked away, they came back. It started with a phone call. Gavin, after 8 years of silence, reaching out as if the time between us had been nothing more than a brief intermission. There was something in his voice that I couldn't quite place. Not warmth, not regret, but something calculated, something rehearsed. He told me he had been thinking about me, that he wanted to reconnect, that it was time to put the past behind us. And for a moment, just a fleeting second, I let myself believe it. But then came the questions, the careful probing, the subtle mentions of my business, my financial success, the things that I had built in the years since they had last spoken to me. And suddenly, it all became clear. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because they needed something. It's a strange thing, the way time stretches and contracts depending on the weight of what you carry. The first year after the divorce had crawled by, each day heavy with the suffocating silence of an empty home, the echo of laughter that no longer filled the rooms, the absence of voices that had once defined my purpose. I remember how the days blurred into one another, how I'd wake up every morning with that brief, blissful moment where I had forgotten that I wasn't a husband anymore, that I wasn't really a father in any tangible way, that the life I had built had unraveled before I had even realized I was losing it. But then reality would settle in, slow and merciless, and I'd feel the weight of it all over again. At first, I tried to hold on. I reached out more times than I care to admit, left messages that were never returned, sent texts that sat unread. Every attempt was met with silence, a void where my children's love had once been. I told myself that maybe they just needed time, that they were caught in the middle, confused, unsure of how to navigate the wreckage their mother had created. I convinced myself that if I was patient, if I gave them space, they'd come back to me eventually. But time has a cruel way of proving you wrong, of stripping away illusions until you are left with nothing but the truth, raw and unfiltered. And the truth was, they had made their choice. It wasn't an easy thing to accept, that kind of rejection. It wasn't like losing a friend or even like the betrayal of a spouse. It was something deeper, something that shook the very foundation of who I was. Because no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, no matter how much I told myself that they had been manipulated, that Marie had painted me as the villain in her own carefully crafted version of events, there was still a part of me that wondered if maybe, just maybe, they had chosen to leave because I hadn't been enough. I buried myself in work, threw everything I had into my coaching, into the only thing that still felt like it had purpose. I spent long hours at the field, guiding my players, watching them grow, finding solace in the idea that even if I had failed as a father in my own home, maybe I could still be something meaningful to someone else's kid. And for a while, that was enough. Or at least I told myself it was. But then came the weddings. Gavin had been first. I found out through social media, scrolling mindlessly through my feed when his face appeared, dressed in a suit, standing beside a woman I had never met, smiling in a way that made my chest tighten. The caption beneath the photo had been brief, celebratory, words about love, about new beginnings. There had been dozens of comments, congratulations from family and friends, people I had once considered my own. And then I saw it, the pictures of Marie and her husband front and center, beaming, embraced like they were the proudest parents in the world. And me? I hadn't even known it was happening. A part of me had expected the pain, had braced for it the moment I realized how far apart we had grown. But knowing something is coming doesn't make it hurt any less when it arrives. Hannah followed not long after. Another wedding I was not invited to, another milestone I watched from the outside looking in. I told myself I wouldn't make the mistake of searching for photos, that I wouldn't put myself through that kind of self-inflicted cruelty again. But of course I did. And of course it was the same as before. Marie's husband standing in my place, her new family wrapped around my children like I had never existed at all. That was the moment I stopped reaching out. Not in anger, not even in bitterness, but in a quiet understanding that some things are not meant to be repaired. So I moved on, or at least I tried. The next few years passed in a strange kind of haze, a period of rebuilding that felt less like progress and more like survival. I had always thought of life as something linear, something that followed a path you could navigate if you just kept moving forward. But what I learned during those years was that sometimes life isn't a path at all. Sometimes it's a series of fractures, moments of breaking and rebuilding, of losing and starting over. And so I built, not the kind of life I had before, not a replacement for what was lost, but something entirely different. I left behind the house Marie had fought so hard to keep, the one that had once been filled with memories I could no longer bear to live alongside. I found a small place of my own, something modest, something that belonged only to me. I focused on my work, on my players, on the sense of fulfillment that came from knowing I was making a difference, even if it wasn't in the way I had originally imagined. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a man who had been left behind. Then, almost 8 years to the day since I had walked away from my old life, my phone rang. Gavin's name flashed across the screen, a name I hadn't seen in so long that, for a moment, I wondered if I was imagining it. My first instinct had been hesitation, a brief moment of uncertainty before I answered, my voice unfamiliar even to myself as I greeted a son who had, for all intents and purposes, become a stranger. The words he spoke were careful, measured, the kind that had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. He told me that he had been thinking about me, that he missed me, that he wanted to rebuild what had been lost. And for a moment, I let myself believe it. I let myself imagine that maybe time had done what I had once hoped it would, that it had healed wounds, softened edges, made space for something new. But then the conversation shifted. He started asking questions, subtle at first, about my work, about my business, about how well I had been doing. There was something in his tone, something practiced, something that felt less like a son reconnecting with his father and more like a man making calculations, assessing value. And suddenly it all became clear. This wasn't about rebuilding. It wasn't about love or regret or any of the things I had once prayed for. They had heard about my success. They had seen what I had built. And now, after all these years, they wanted something from me. I sat there with the phone still in my hand long after the call had ended, staring at the screen as though it held some kind of answer, some hidden truth buried beneath the words Gavin had spoken. There had been a time, years ago now, when I would have given anything for that call, when I would have dropped everything just to hear my son say he wanted to reconnect, to try again, to rebuild something that had been lost. But now that it had happened, now that his voice had reached through the years of silence and found its way back to me, all I felt was a quiet, uneasy weight settling in my chest. Because I knew. I knew what he wasn't saying. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about regret or longing or even a slow realization that maybe he had been wrong to cut me out. It was about something else entirely. Money. I should have seen it coming. The years I had spent rebuilding my life had not just given me stability, they had given me success. What had once been a struggling career had turned into something bigger than I had ever expected, something profitable, something that had allowed me to carve out a space for myself in a world that, for so long, had felt like it no longer wanted me. I had partnered with an old friend, built a business from the ground up, turned my coaching experience into something that not only helped young athletes, but also brought in more money than I had ever thought possible. And somehow, word had gotten back to them. For years, my children had erased me from their lives, had left me behind without hesitation, without remorse. They had built their futures without me, started their families without me, shared their milestones with another man while I had watched from the sidelines, unwanted and unneeded. But now, suddenly, after all this time, they were reaching out. And I was supposed to believe it was just coincidence. I wanted to believe I was wrong. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something genuine beneath Gavin's carefully chosen words, that perhaps time had done what I had always hoped it would, that it had softened their hearts, that it had reminded them of the father they had once loved, that it had shown them that no betrayal, no distance, no lapse in judgment could ever truly sever the bond we had once shared. But I had learned the hard way that wanting something to be true doesn't make it so, and so I waited. I let the days pass, let the silence stretch between us again, watching to see what would happen next. And sure enough, the next call came, this time from Hannah. Her voice, once so familiar, felt almost foreign now, the same way Gavin's had, like a stranger wearing the face of someone I used to know. She was warm, overly affectionate in a way that felt rehearsed, her words dripping with nostalgia as she reminded me of old memories, of times we had spent together, of childhood moments that she suddenly, after all these years, seemed desperate to relive. But then, just as with Gavin, the conversation took a turn. She started asking about my business, about my success, about the kind of life I was living now. And suddenly, the picture became painfully clear. They weren't just reconnecting, They were planning something. It wasn't just a casual interest in their father's well-being. It was a careful assessment, a weighing of options, a strategic attempt to pull me back into their lives at the exact moment it became convenient for them to do so. And the worst part? I almost let myself fall for it. Because deep down, beneath all the hurt and all the bitterness and all the years of silence, I was still their father. And no matter how much I had tried to bury that part of me, no matter how much I had told myself that I was done, that I had let them go, that I had moved on, the truth was that a part of me still ached for them. A part of me still wanted them to come home, but not like this. I wasn't naive. I'd spent too many years learning how people worked, how manipulation crept in through the smallest cracks, how even those you once trusted could turn selfish when the right opportunity presented itself. And yet, knowing that didn't make it hurt any less. I let them talk. I let them weave their stories, let them play their roles, let them tell me all the things they thought I wanted to hear. And then, just as I knew they would, they asked for something. A favor, a connection, a financial opportunity, something small, something simple, something that would require just a little effort on my part. An introduction to an investor, a loan to get them started, a chance to break into a business world they had no experience in but were suddenly, inexplicably, interested in. And that was when I knew without a doubt that this wasn't about love. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about family. It was about what I could offer, what I could give, what they could take. And that was the moment something inside me shifted. For so long, I had been waiting for the call, waiting for the apology, waiting for the moment when my children would finally realize what they had lost, when they would finally see me not as an obligation, not as an afterthought, but as their father. And for so long, I had told myself that if that moment ever came, I would welcome it with open arms, that I would drop everything just to have them back, that I would let the past fade away in exchange for whatever future they were willing to offer. But now that the moment was here, I realized something I had never understood before. I wasn't waiting for them. I was waiting for a version of them that no longer existed. The children I had loved, the ones I had raised, the ones I had fought for, the ones I had once believed would stand by me no matter what, were gone. And in their place stood two adults who bore their names, who carried their faces, but who saw me as nothing more than an opportunity. And I had a choice to make. I could give them what they wanted. I could step back into their lives, play the role they had written for me, pretend that the past didn't matter, that the years of silence and rejection and indifference had never happened. I could convince myself that this was better than nothing, that even a fractured, conditional version of fatherhood was worth clinging to, or I could let them go. Not just in theory, not just in words, but truly, finally let them go. I'd spent so many years mourning the loss of my family, but maybe it was time to stop mourning ghosts. Maybe it was time to move forward, not for them, not for what they wanted from me, but for myself. And so I made my decision. I wasn't going to be their backup plan. I wasn't going to be their safety net. I wasn't going to be the man they turned to only when it was convenient. I had built something for myself, a life that was full, a life that was mine, a life that was no longer defined by what I had lost, but by what I had created. And I wasn't about to give that up. Not for them. Not anymore. There was a time when I would have ignored my instincts, brushed away my suspicions, and convinced myself that my children's sudden return had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with convenience, nothing to do with the fact that I had built a life for myself beyond the wreckage they had left me in. I would have let my hope cloud my judgment, would have told myself that people change, that wounds heal, that maybe they had simply needed time to see things clearly. But I wasn't that man anymore. I had spent too many years learning how to be alone, too many nights staring at a silent phone, too many holidays spent as an afterthought to believe in fairy tales. I had learned through absence, through rejection, through the cold reality of indifference, that love is not always unconditional, that sometimes even those who were supposed to stand by you will walk away without looking back. And when they finally turn around, when they come knocking after years of silence, it's rarely out of guilt or remorse. It's because they want something. And Gavin and Hannah wanted something. The realization sat heavy in my chest, a weight that I knew would have crushed me once. But now, it only made me tired. Not angry, not heartbroken, just tired. Because in the end, this was the moment of truth, the test that would reveal whether they had come back for me or for what I could offer them. So I waited. I let them keep calling, let them keep testing the waters, weaving their carefully crafted words, lacing them with just enough warmth, just enough nostalgia to sound sincere. I listened as they talked about how much they missed me, how they regretted the distance, how they wanted to make things right. But I also paid attention to what they didn't say. There was no acknowledgement of the years I had spent trying to reach them, of the messages they had ignored, of the weddings I had been excluded from, of the milestones I had been denied. There was no apology, no moment of reckoning where they admitted they had chosen their mother's version of events over mine, that they had let another man take my place without so much as a second thought. Instead, they spoke in vague, practiced phrases, carefully sidestepping the truth, pretending the past had simply been an unfortunate accident rather than a deliberate choice. And then finally came the moment I had been waiting for, the favor. It wasn't a direct request at first. Gavin mentioned that his job wasn't as stable as he had hoped, that the market had shifted, that he and his wife were considering new opportunities, looking into investments, trying to build something of their own. Hannah followed with a similar story. Her husband was struggling to get his business off the ground. Things had been tight, and they were thinking of branching out into something new. The words were casual, spoken as if they were just sharing, just opening up. But the intent was clear. They were fishing, waiting to see if I would take the bait. Once upon a time, I might have. I might have jumped at the opportunity to be useful to them, to prove that I was still their father, that I could still provide, still be someone they needed. I might have told myself that this was my way back in, that if I just gave a little, they would see me again, not as a resource, but as a person, as a father. But I wasn't that man anymore, so I did something that surprised even me. I told them no. I didn't make excuses. I didn't soften the blow. I simply told them that I had worked too hard to rebuild my life, to carve out something meaningful from the ruins of my past, and that I had no intention of handing over what I had built to people who had shown me time and time again that I was only worth as much as what I could offer. The silence on the other end of the call had been deafening, and in that silence I heard everything I needed to know. Because there was no disappointment, no sadness, no attempt to say, "That's okay, Dad. We just wanted to reconnect." There was only the quiet calculation of people realizing they had miscalculated, that their plan had failed, that I wasn't the easy mark they had assumed I would be. They hung up shortly after that, and just like that, the call stopped. No more messages, no more friendly check-ins, no more sudden interest in my life. It was as if, the moment I stopped being a potential asset, I stopped existing again. And I could have let it break me. I could have let it confirm every fear, every painful doubt that had haunted me for years. That maybe I really wasn't enough. That maybe I had failed as a father. That maybe if I had done something differently, they would have stayed. But instead, I felt something else. Relief. Because now there was no more pretending, no more wondering, no more second-guessing whether I had given up too soon or if I should have tried harder. Now I knew. And knowing was freedom. For the first time in years, I felt truly, undeniably free. Because I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for them, not for something that was never coming, not for a version of them that had long since ceased to exist. I had spent too long mourning a family that had already moved on without me. And now, finally, I was ready to do the same. Update. There is something strange about the way closure comes. Not as a grand moment of reckoning, not as some cinematic confrontation where all the right words are spoken, where the past is dissected, and wrongs are acknowledged. Instead, it arrives in silence, in the absence of something that once weighed heavily on your soul. It is not an explosion, but a slow, quiet realization that the storm is past, that the weight you carried for so long is no longer pressing down on you, that you are finally free from the cycle of hope and disappointment that once defined you. For years, I had lived in the shadow of what had been taken from me, measuring my happiness not by what I had, but by what I had lost. I had convinced myself that my story was incomplete without the people who had walked away, that I was somehow unfinished without the family I had spent decades loving, fighting for, and mourning when they chose to leave. But now, for the first time, I saw things differently. It was not that I had been waiting for them. It was that I had been waiting for myself. To reach this point, to truly understand that I was whole, that I had been whole all along, even without them. It was a few weeks after I'd refused Gavin and Hannah's thinly veiled request for financial assistance that I noticed the shift. At first, I thought maybe they would try again, that they would regroup, rethink their strategy, attempt a different approach. But the silence remained. The calls stopped, the messages ceased, and their brief, manufactured attempt at reconciliation evaporated like mist in the morning sun. And that was how I knew. Not that they had failed to get what they wanted, but that they had never truly wanted me in the first place. It should have hurt. A version of me from years ago would have spiraled, would have replayed the moment over and over again, searching for where I had gone wrong, where I had failed. I would have obsessed over every detail, would have looked back on their childhoods and questioned whether I had been too strict, too distant, too caught up in my own struggles to see what they needed from me. But that version of me was gone, and what remained was someone who had finally learned what it meant to let go. Letting go was not the same as giving up. Letting go did not mean I had stopped loving them. It did not mean I no longer wished things had been different. It simply meant that I had accepted reality for what it was, not for what I wished it to be. It meant that I no longer spent my days looking at my phone, waiting for a call that would never come for the right reasons. It meant that I had chosen to stop defining my worth by whether or not they decided to remember that I existed. And with that realization, something inside me shifted. I woke up one morning, and for the first time in years, I felt light. It was a feeling I had forgotten, one I had not even realized had been absent until it returned. There was no knot in my chest, no lingering bitterness. The anger, the sadness, the exhaustion of years spent holding on to something that had long since crumbled, it was gone. I got up, made my coffee, stepped outside onto the small porch of the house I had chosen for myself, and just breathed in the crisp morning air. And for the first time, I truly saw my life for what it was. Not the remnants of something broken, not a consolation prize for the things I had lost, but something full, something real, something mine. My business was thriving, not just in financial success, but in the impact it had on the young athletes who walked through its doors, seeking guidance, mentorship, and a place where they felt they belonged. I had built something lasting, something meaningful, something that did not depend on the approval or recognition of those who had chosen to walk away. I had friends, real ones, people who had stood by me through it all, who had never asked for anything in return except my company, my presence, my friendship. People who had become my family in ways that went deeper than blood, in ways that were built not on obligation, but on choice. And most importantly, I had myself. For years, I had convinced myself that I was missing something, that there was an emptiness inside me that could only be filled by the return of the people who had left. But now, I saw it for what it was, an illusion, a ghost of a belief that had never been true. I was not missing anything. I had everything I needed. The past would always be part of me. The love I had for my children would never disappear, no matter what had happened. But love was not a chain. It was not something that forced you to stay in a place where you were no longer wanted. It was not something that required you to beg for scraps of affection or to trade your self-respect for the mere hope of being seen. And so I let them go. Truly, fully, without resentment. Not because I had to, but because I finally understood that I deserved better. And as I stood there, sipping my coffee, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, I knew, deep in my bones, in the very core of who I was, that I had won. Not in the way they had measured success, not in wealth or status or in proving a point, but in the way that mattered, because I was at peace, and they would never take that from me again.